Okay. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byron of Sidious. And this is going to be one of my intermittent overview videos for different novels that I've been reading through. Most recently, I've been spending a good deal of time reading older books that I have in my collection that I received from a friend from my prior workplace. In that vein, the the first half of this video, we'll be looking at a set of novels from Harry Harrison, the Deathworld novels, which were first written and published back in the early to mid 1960s. This was hard/high sci-fi, and just going to go through some basic observations regarding these books. And then for the second half of this video, we're going to be looking at the novelization of a video game, actually. Looking at the novelization of Alan Wake. So this is a two-parter in one video. Starting with the Deathworld novels. First published in the 1960s, Harry Harrison's Deathworld novels are an example of adventure space opera written in an era when Harrison's glib wit and action-first style were standard setting in the field of sci-fi. The first of these books introduces readers to a dynamic protagonist in risk-taker Jason Denault, who takes to Pyrrhus, a planet steeped in deadly flora and fauna, all seemingly hell-bent on the absolute annihilation of the humans who populate the planet. Possessed of minor psionic abilities, or psychic abilities, established early on in the tale, before he even arrives at Pyrrhus, Denault has become largely bored with most known human galactic locales and day-to-day life. He sees very few challenges. Hence, he is intrigued when a Pyrran man tracks him down and offers him a challenge. Gamble and win the Pyrran and his people a huge amount of money to fund his people's war efforts against the planet of Pyrrhus itself. Wanting something more, Denault goes with this man to the deadly planet where, due to its heightened gravity, Jason is rendered almost infantile physically. I don't want to summarize the entirety of the books here and waste a lot of your time, folks. It would be honestly taking too much willpower to not go in depth in those works, and in the process end up tearing them apart and grumbling about them at length. I will say this much, however. The first book, while making me grumble a little bit at the Ubermensch status conferred upon protagonist Denault, is actually a fun adventure story with some thoughtful concepts to be extrapolated from its events. Readers are offered minimal detail regarding most of its deadly wildlife, and while this might normally be seen as lazy or skimping on detail, it actually works quite well here. Many of the hostile beasts are named or given colloquial terms and labels by the pirate people, and this allows, based upon their naming, the reader to then fill in the visual details for themselves, which can be exceptionally effective when telling this sort of story. But again, I refer back to a large part of what I had trouble with reading even the first book was that despite his limitations, because of the physical nature of the planet, Denault finds a way to end up kind of skirting around these limitations, which is something that, yes, you want your protagonist to prove adaptability in order to overcome the challenge, the conquest of the story that they must overcome. That's part of character growth. That's fine and dandy. The trouble that I run into when reading the first book is that it seems almost so automatic for him. But again, The first book in the series, not terrible. It was an enjoyable read on its own. As for book two in this trilogy, the book boiled down for me to an issue of taste. Jason Denault is a moral relativist, and I personally find such people to be negatively manipulative and distasteful in my real day to day life. And the moment that Harrison showed this as an effective, positive trait for Jason Denault as a character, I had trouble with the idea of wanting him to continue to succeed. I'm not comfortable with that kind of success in a character when they can effectively be shown to be a complete manipulator and be rewarded for it. It strikes me as unsettling. And book three of the trilogy seems, on the whole, to undo any and all progress that the Pyran people in book one made by the end of that tale, rendering its events almost meaningless. By the time you finish book three in the Deathworld trilogy, you look back at book one and say, was there even a point to what happened in this story? Because at this juncture, the events of book three effectively rip those characters out of their situation and circumstances and say, hey, this work that you've been putting in on your society and your civilization to improve your station and to improve who you are is rendered irrelevant. It no longer matters, which, I don't know, feels self defeating, as if the whole point of the story in that first book got rendered meaningless. It was just more accolades for character Jason Denault to rack up into his heroic backstory. So I don't know. If you are going to go back for these old tales by Harry Harrison, I would recommend read the first book, sure, but then just stop. Don't continue forward with book two or book three. They're not, in my estimation, worth continuing the story of this character. It works just fine for the first book. It's enjoyable. It's a decently told story. But beyond that, I would say detach from this character and detach from these stories. Or you may find yourself in the same situation and headspace as I did, ultimately annoyed with them. Now, on to the novelization of Alan Wake, written by Rick Burroughs. Um, this is going to be obviously a much different tone from that prior entry. If you're even tangentially aware of video games over the last couple of decades, you will likely have heard of the game Alan Wake, produced by Remedy Studios. Known for their deep appreciation of world building and capacity as storytellers in the video game medium, Remedy ultimately made what I think was a curious choice when it comes to the tale of Wake. They had a book written about a writer who's having trouble with his writer's block, based on their game, using this base introduction premiere, or premise, rather. So you've got the game's story is about Alan Wake, a writer who is suffering from a long period of writer's block. And that's what ends up compelling him and his wife Alice to go to Bright Falls. And then you write a book about a writer who's having writer's block. It's just, I don't know. To me, I find it a little ironic and amusing to have that sort of cyclical nature to it. Um, so for this overview, if you've not played the game, there's gameplay video and breakdowns and analyses all over YouTube and Odyssey and BitChute and Rumble. Just go to any gaming channel that has touched upon this game, and I'm sure that you'll get an appreciation for what exactly the game manages to accomplish. And as someone who did play the game, and then years later has now read this book, I have somewhat mixed feelings. But I've broken this down into a couple of quick commentary sections: the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. So, the good. For a first time novel, and Rick Burroughs clarifies that in the afterword of the novel, is that this was his first novel. His first work as an author was an adaptation of video game. Um, Curious choice. But for a first time novel, Burroughs demonstrates some clear command of crisp, clean language when describing characters, environments, and even supernatural phenomena. His dialogue closely mirrors the game's script, but also allows for certain subtle details that an audio-visual presentation of a tale doesn't get to, such as interior monologue. The bad. If you've played the video game that this novel is based on, you're going to feel somewhat left flat by reading the book. This is unavoidable, but in its way lends to something beautiful, which I'll get to shortly. Also, Burroughs' less action-packed sequences sometimes feel sparse, as though he was relying on readers being familiar with some of the visuals of the game to help their mind's eye while reading. Very possible. The ugly, unanswered questions. And we're going to see that this is a component of the fact that Remedy Studios, when crafting the lore and the world building elements of Alan Wake and the subsequent DLC or downloadable content, tying it into the game Control and the FBC, the Federal Bureau of Control, and the various bits of sort of meta knowledge, the lore that all kind of wraps together. Um, you're going to end up with some unanswered questions, and the fact that they're looking at, in the distance in the future at potentially a sequel title, a sequel game, you want to leave some open roads to travel down in order to get to that sequel. So unanswered questions are almost an inevitability. Still, as a standalone novel reading experience, it can leave one wondering, why did I just spend this time getting into this book when so much is left open? That can be a good thing if you're looking into sort of weird fiction, the open-ended uncertainties of things like the writings of Lovecraft and what have you, where you don't get answers, you don't have things wrapped up in a nice, neat, tidy package. That can be effective for weird speculative fiction. It can work. Now, it happens, and usually it doesn't pan out, and it never gets revisited. And when that happens, it always sucks. But again, going into this book, I already knew there was a possibility that things were not going to get clarified. So temper your expectations based upon that. The beautiful, however, and this is my lengthiest section of observation for this book. If ever there was a case to be made for video games to be viewed as art, this novel, in conjunction with the game, makes the argument by way of contrast. Art evokes an emotional and intellectual reaction from its audience. Traditionally speaking, the more powerful the reaction, the more relevant the work as a piece of art. What Alan Wake offers us for consideration is the artistic merit of agency. Yes, the story of the game has predetermined and pre-written story beats and a set narrative framework for the game to take place. However, unlike the novel, the game grants players, those taking in the art, options insofar as how to go through that narrative. Rather than passively allowing the art to be presented to us and being guided along unseen rails through the course of the story, we become active participants in the body of the work. There is a downside to this, of course. One needs not only the time and inclination to invest in that form of art, in that medium, but also the skill and patience to work their own way through that art. Thankfully, nowadays, there's video playthroughs on YouTube, Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and what have you. For folks like me, who either don't have the games or the systems that they can be played on, don't have the time, or who don't have the skill to master these games. For instance, I have never owned a PlayStation 3 or 4, but I've become fairly well versed and familiar with the lore and the legendarium of the game Bloodborne. It's not as complete a knowledge as someone might have who's actually spent time steeped in the game, actively playing it, being able to take a first-hand knowledge approach, but I am familiar with the lore. And this is where that conversation becomes relevant in terms of video games as a form of art. The player participates in part of the creative process. The individuals and the team that build, that construct the game, what they're doing is not just crafting a toy for you to play with, particularly not in an era where our video game systems and capacities have become so advanced and so sophisticated that we can get lost in the worlds that are created within the confines of the game. It allows us to partake of the details, to change the narrative in terms of, well, okay, let's say for instance, um, let's take a game like Dragon Age. Okay, there are optional side quests and Easter eggs and side, little things that you can do to enhance your experience or to draw it out further. Things that can add to the lore and to the overall narrative of the story that you're playing through. But these details are not essential. They don't necessarily have a grand effect on the overarching main narrative arc, but they can offer little details that the player has to go out of their way to partake of. You don't get this in straight fiction. Now, I'm not a video game programmer, designer, writer of any sort. I'm just a narrative fiction author. But I would stress that anyone who wants to dismiss video games out of hand as a form of art should spend some time considering that, particularly nowadays, with what we can do with a video game, is it possible that we find ourselves confronted with a new medium? Not new, because video games have been around for a long enough time now, but when placed against the backdrop of how long art forms like music and uh, written fiction and painting and illustration, those art forms have been around forever. Okay, but we have this new medium, and believe it or not, it's still so young. that the available options of what we can do with it seem limitless. And are we making the most of our capacities, our capabilities, when it comes to telling a story with this medium? I don't know. I'm rambling at this point. Anyhow, that's all for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.